when the situation is hot. And we find once again these three Hebrew boys. Beginning at verse 16 of chapter 3, it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Somebody say he's able. Able. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. God's word. I want to use as a heading with the help of the Lord for just a few moments when the situation is hot. Here once again we have one of the great biblical narratives. Recently there was a survey taken about the top 10 Bible stories of all time. And this narrative of the three Hebrew boys ranked at the very top. One of the greatest Bible stories of all time. Moses parting the Red Sea, Abraham and Sarah, stories and narratives of the life of Joseph, and of course, in the New Testament, the miracles of Jesus. But here, this Old Testament narrative speaks to us today to remind us that when the situations of life are hot, that God is still able to deliver us. Have you ever been in a hot situation? Have you ever had a fiery furnace? Because listen, sooner or later, regardless of your GPA, your credit score, your last name, your job title, your neighborhood, regardless of your past experiences, sooner or later, life is so prearranged by God that every now and then we face a fiery furnace situation. And what is a fiery furnace? A fiery furnace is something that you cannot control, something that you have been thrown into or thrust into, and something that only God can get you out of. And so today, there may be someone in this sanctuary right now who's in a fiery furnace. Maybe it's a fiery furnace of fear. Maybe it's a furnace of frustration. Maybe it's a furnace of financial challenges. Maybe it's a furnace of family matters. Maybe it's a furnace of just an unknown situation. But let me assure you, don't look now, but the person you're sitting next to, the person you're sitting next to right now, is either in a furnace right now, coming out of a furnace, or on their way into a fiery furnace. Because life is so orchestrated that way. But let me suggest to you once again, whenever God puts us in a furnace, he's able to deliver us. Does anybody know he's able to deliver? In fact, Warren Wiersbe says, whenever God puts us in a fiery furnace, he keeps his eye on the clock and his hand on the thermostat. He won't let us stay too long, and he won't let it get too hot. Isn't that good news today? But let's look once again at this narrative of these three Hebrew young men who find themselves in this furnace. And there are several moves in this passage. In fact, Act 1, if I could break it down into 3 acts. The first act, we see that these young men are challenged because there is a changing in their standards. There's a move, there's a goal, there's an attempt to change their standards. And so when we read the book of Daniel, remember it is the story of God's people as they have been deported to the kingdom or the nation of Babylon. And so now they are being enculturated with Chaldean symbols and Chaldean history. In fact, we know these three young men biblically as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But their names have been changed. Look at your neighbor and say their names have been changed. In an attempt to immerse them in Chaldean culture, their names were changed. Hold on to that. Keep that on the left side of your brain. because I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Their names have been changed. Shadrach's name was formerly Hananiah. Meshach was Mishael. And so their names have been changed to reflect the gods and the moons and the mores of this new culture. Abednego had been known as Amariah, and so now their names have been changed as they come into a new culture. They were the perfect models for what Babylon was trying to do. They took the best and the brightest from the nation of Israel and started to inculcate them with their culture. They took those who had no birth defects, those who were from noble families, and started to change them. They gave them new names. They taught them a new history. They took away their old culture and began to give them a new culture. And as African Americans, we can understand and know what it's like to be taken from one home and enculturated into another homeland. Late Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, he wrote a book many years ago entitled "They Came Before Columbus," and he talks about our forebears and ancestors, how they were transitioned into the Americas even before 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, and their names were what? Changed. Their history was retold. Everything was taken away. You know from the documentary Roots that Kota Kinte became who? Toby. Kota Kinte. He held on as long as he could to his name, because they knew if they could change their names, they could change their identities. And as they changed their identities, they could change their way of thinking. And so it was a shift to change the standards and the way these young men thought. And so remember, the book of Daniel is written by that namesake. He was one of the emerging leaders in Babylon. He came too with those who were deported. And these were three of his friends. They were rising high in the Chaldean cabinet and in political affairs. But because they had standards, ultimately they faced challenges. And so when we move to scene 2 of this memorable passage, we see that they took a stance because they held firm on their standards. Dr. Martin Luther King said that if a man or a woman won't stand for anything, they will fall for everything. And because they took a stand on what they believed, they said to the king, "We won't bow to your golden and graven images and your gods, lowercase." And so what precipitated this stance, this struggle? We're told in this passage that Nebuchadnezzar has built an edifice or a statue in honor of himself. Okay, you all missed that. You thought Donald Trump had a high ego, but Nebuchadnezzar has built a statue to himself. In fact, the Bible tells us that it was 60 cubits high. That's 90 feet. The same logistics as an 8-story building in Manhattan. An 8-story skyrise. And so he has built this image to himself. And he has ordered everyone, once it's unveiled, to bow down to this image. And so this is a practice that occurs in the hills of Dura, as described in this passage, the mountains of Babylon. And so everyone bows to this graven image, except 3 people. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are only 3 people that don't bow to this image, is these 3 young men. And just by way of application, you never know who's watching you. And so it gets back to the king that when we bow before your great image, O king, there are 3 people who remain standing. There are 3 people who don't bow. And so they are reported to the king. And as a result, now, because they have taken this stand, they face capital punishment because the law requires anyone who does not stand will be punished by death in a fiery furnace. But yet and still, because of their beliefs, somebody say beliefs, because of their beliefs, they would not bow to this graven image. And can I just remind you for a moment that sooner or later in life, we all have to make that decision to bow or not to bow, to bow or not to bow, to bow to the ways of this world, this culture, or to be transformed, as Paul says, by the what? By the renewing of our minds. So these three young men took a stance, and they would not bow to the graven image. And I don't know about you, but I'm glad that men and women who have come before us took a stance against some of the issues and challenges of life and this world. We're thankful today for the memory of Ida Wells Barnett. This past week was the celebration of her birthday. Ida Wells Barnett was a pioneering woman in the late 19th and early 20th century. She was born a slave. Her father was enslaved, her mother, her grandmother, in Holly Springs, Mississippi. But once they were released with the Emancipation Proclamation, her father became what they called a race man. He fought for equality in Holly Springs, Mississippi in the late 1800s. Now, I don't have to tell you that was a dangerous proposition. Fighting, saying that Black Lives Matter in Holly Springs, Mississippi in the late 1800s. But that same spirit fell upon their daughter, Ida. Ida was in college and she got expelled from the university. She was going to Shaw University and she got expelled from the college because she felt the president wasn't doing enough to help and fight for rights and privileges of the colored race. And so, in the early 1900s, we know one of the greatest tragedies of American history is the long list of lynchings, public lynchings. They call them, you can put the N-word in front of it, they called it barbecues. They were printed in newspapers and on Sunday afternoons gathered to watch those horrific lynchings and burnings of bodies. Billie Holiday, that great singer, wrote the song Strange Fruit, blowing in the southern wind. And so Ida Wells fought against lynching. She was an anti-lynching crusader, went all over the world. But this same woman, who we celebrate her birthday and the stance that she took this week, on the same day of her birthday, we got the tragic and horrific news out of Harris County, right outside of Houston, close to Hempstead, Texas, that a young woman, 28 years of age, Sandra Bland, driving from Chicago to her new job, stopped for a failure to signal her traffic light, and then 48 hours later, found hanging in her jail cell. What horrific times we live in, my brothers and sisters. What challenging moments these are for us. This is indeed a fiery furnace, isn't it? It's a fiery furnace as we continue to fight for equality. The fiery furnace is this past week. We had the ominous anniversary of the death of Eric Garner in Staten Island. And so even as we sit in this sanctuary today, we still fight the battle for equality, don't we? We still fight the battle for those majestic words of Dr. King, that one day we will not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. But even as we fight for that battle, we still remain in a fiery furnace. And this is where we find these three young men. They are in a fiery furnace, but look at their response. I read that they say that, "O great King, we won't bow before the image." Verse 17, and then they say, "Our God is able to deliver." Somebody ought to get that right there. They say, "We won't bow to your image." They said, "Our God is able to deliver us." But then they said, "But even if not, even if he doesn't deliver us, we still won't bow to your graven images." They said, "Our God is able to do it." Anybody know once again that he's able to do? He's able to deliver you, and he's our situations right now. But even if he doesn't decide to do it, he's still good. Even if he doesn't decide, he's still worthy. Even if he doesn't do it, that means he's got something else around the corner. Whenever God closes one door, he'll open up a window somewhere else. And so they say, even if he doesn't, he can still fix our situation. And that's what we see in scene 2. They are now taken into the fiery furnace. They are now approaching this horrific fair, going into a fiery furnace. But can I help somebody? If you're in a fiery furnace right now, one writer says one of the things that we can do is to glance at our problems, but to stare at Jesus. I know that's easier said than done, but if you can just glance at your problems and stare at Jesus, glance at what's facing you, but then stare at the one who's able. And so they find themselves in scene 3 in this fiery furnace. Is there anybody here who's ever been in a fiery furnace? I mean, you can understand what they're facing. A fiery furnace that has you in dismay. A furnace that has you wondering, how am I going to get out of this? Have you ever had a situation like that? You know that God is able. You know that God can do it. I sat in hospital rooms. I sat with my parents. I know that the Lord could heal them. But I said, but if not, I know he's still good. He's still God. He's still on the throne. So, somebody, you can testify. You've been in a situation for an interview. You say, if God blesses me with this, I know he's worthy. But even if he doesn't, I know he's got something else for me. If God fixes this situation, he's able. But even if he doesn't decide to fix it my way, I know that he's still got a better way. Because he's able. He's able. Yes, he is. He's able because, listen, worry looks around. And then when we have regret, we look back. But when we have faith, we look up. And when you've got a fiery furnace situation, you and I have to learn once again to look up. The songwriter said, my faith looks up to thee, O Lamb of Calvary. If you and I can just look up. Anybody looking up right now? I mean, maybe you're going through something you can't understand it, but you still know how to look up. Maybe you're waiting on something right now. It hasn't materialized, so you're just looking up. You're waiting on God to do something. It hasn't come to pass yet, but you're still learning to just look up unto the hills. Because when you look up to the hills, you'll find where your help comes from. Does anybody's help come from the Lord? And these 3 young men find themselves in a fiery furnace. And they say, God is able, but if not, we know he's still good. But notice the king says that the furnace is going to be turned up 7 times hotter, 7 times warmer than normal. That means as soon as their feet hit the furnace, they should be gone. Because if he kept it at the regular level, it would be a slow torture. But because he liked them, he turns it up 7 times hotter. In fact, even when the soldiers bound them and escort them into the fire, the Bible says that they were burned immediately. Those who took them to the furnace. If I had more time, I'd tell you, don't worry about people who set you up. Don't worry about people who forsake you. Don't worry about people who turn their backs on you. Don't worry when the wicked, even my enemies, came against me to devour my flesh. The psalmist says they stumbled and failed. These soldiers who took them to their capital punishment, they were burned immediately. But when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego enter the furnace, it turns into a climate control situation. Everything around them is on fire, but they're still cool. Everything around them is burning, but they're still intact. Everything around them is falling apart, but they're still standing firm. Everything around them has erupted, but they're still safe in his arms. Because God has a special covering and protection for their divine assignment. Can I help somebody who's in a furnace today? Can I help somebody who's never been in a furnace he'll go with you. When you go in the heartbreak, he'll go with you. When you go in the hospital, he'll go with you. When you go to the courtroom, he'll go with you. When you go to surgery, he'll go with you. When you go to the bank, he'll go with you. When you go to a meeting, he'll go with you. When you go to purchase a house, he'll go with you. When you go to close a deal, he'll go with you. When you don't know what's going on, he will. Yes, he will. He'll go with you. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I'm so glad he'll never leave me or forsake me. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. No. Never alone. No. Never alone. He's with me. He's with you. He's Emmanuel. He's God with us. God with us in the fire. God with us in the flames. God with us when things are on fire. God with us when things are burning up. God with us in oppression. God with us in depression. God with us in bad times. God with us in good times. God with us. God with us. Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Won't he do it? He's able. He's able to meet me and to meet you. The pre-incarnate Christ shows up 3 men winning before men